Well, we're going to have a Q&A, so I better get started. In global politics, as in life, context is vital. As the most important negotiations in modern history of Canada begin for Canada with the other NAFTA nations in August, it's important to step back for a minute and reflect on the nature of the Canada-US Association and where it has led us over the decades. The fundamental goal of government is to make a better world, a world that is safe for democracy and a world that is free from deprivation and free from degradation. For 40 years, the United States of America and the Soviet Union were the world's two superpowers, the leaders of the West and the East, of NATO and the Warsaw Pact, and the keepers, in President Kennedy's words, of a hard and a bitter peace. And then in 1985, there came to power in the Kremlin a man named Mikhail Gorbachev, who questioned the assumptions of the Soviet system, ended the arms race and ultimately the Cold War, disbanded the East Bloc, the Warsaw Pact, and finally, the tyranny of the Soviet Federation itself. I remember sitting across a conference table from him in a private meeting in the Kremlin just 3 hours after he assumed power in 1985. And I have to tell you, I never, ever would have thought it possible. There he was, flanked by Andrei Gromyko. You remember warm, cuddly, affectionate Andrei Gromyko. Well, this new leader of the Soviet Union spoke to me with confidence of the future, but gave precious few indications of the convulsive changes he was about to unleash, so profound, as it turned out, that he and his administration and his federation would be consumed by them. For Canada and the United States, the post-Cold War world offered unique opportunities and daunting challenges. We began from a common heritage of democratic traditions and a common defense of liberty. There are reminders of that from the trenches of one war to the beaches of the next. Places inscribed in the history of valor where Canadians and Americans fought together, and Canadians and Americans died together in defense of freedom. And because we and our allies have remained true to those values and had the courage and the strength to defend them in NATO, Korea, Afghanistan, the Gulf, and elsewhere, within the last 30 years, the Berlin Wall fell and Germany was reunited. A trade unionist from Gdansk, an electrician like my father, became president of Poland. A dissident poet sat in the castle in Prague as communist regimes tumbled like dominoes across Central and Eastern Europe. And in the Second Russian Revolution, the people of Moscow made a human wall around their parliament, and for the first time in 70 years, Soviet tanks that had crushed every stirring of liberty now, for the first time, dared not cross. Strong political leadership at that time ensured that we came safely through the worst, as President Reagan said to the British Parliament. If the U.S. is to maintain its role of world leadership in political and security matters, and in my judgment it is absolutely vital that it does, it must ensure that its great economy does not falter or fail, because such failure would jeopardize and ultimately vitiate the capacity of the Americans to persuade other nations to share its prescriptions for peace and prosperity around the world. As we know, our world has changed, perhaps forever, because a handful of terrorists flew planes into American landmarks on a beautiful Tuesday morning in September, almost 17 years ago, killing 3,000 innocent men, women, and children. The incredibly cruel atrocities of September 11th constituted a declaration of war not just on America, but on all civilized people. September 11th changed America, as we all know, and with it, the world. They hijacked the Muslim religion, a great and peaceful religion, and in their name they commit these atrocities. And so we have ISIS, radical Islamist terrorist groups around the world that seek to inflict horror on innocent people and destroy our democratic ideals. From the Middle East to the streets of Boston, to the media rooms of Paris, to the halls of our own Canadian Parliament, to Manchester and the slaughter of innocent children. An evil and implacable enemy lurks and advances. This enemy clearly despises Christians and Jews and wants nothing less than their domination and elimination from the face of the earth. This enemy decapitates Christians, but also burns alive in a steel cage a young fellow Muslim and murders thousands more Muslims elsewhere simply because their philosophy differs from the one they advance. This enemy must be resisted by all who value freedom, strongly, loudly, and immediately. And this enemy must be crushed, marginalized, and eradicated from all civilized societies. Achievement occurs when challenge meets leadership. Some years ago, the legendary New York Times columnist Scotty Rustin came to have lunch with me at 24 Sussex. And after an impressive tour d'horizon, Mr. Rustin said, "You know, Prime Minister, for the last 25 years, I have opposed every single policy that your friend Ronald Reagan ever stood for." And then he added, and during that same period, Ronald Reagan was twice elected governor of California and twice elected president of the United States. This self-deprecatory observation, I thought memorable because of its infrequency in the New York Times, was delivered somewhat ruefully, as if Mr. Rustin were perplexed by his own admission. But to so wise an observer as Rustin, the answer surely should have been very clear. It's called leadership, that ineffable and sometimes magical quality that sets some men and women apart so that millions will follow them as they conjure up new visions and invite their countrymen to dream big and exciting dreams. In his seminal work on leadership, James McGregor Burns segregates transactional from transforming leadership. He writes that it is the transforming leader who raises the level of human conduct of both leader and led, who responds to fundamental hopes and aspirations, and who may transcend and even seek to reconstruct the political system rather than simply operate within it. You know, many suggest that great and inexorable currents of history themselves, and not individual leaders, seal our fate. In my judgment, however, Carlyle was on target when he observed that the right man or the right woman in the right place at the right time can completely change the course of history. I believe that to be true because I was there to see it happen. When at the height of the Cold War, you sat around a NATO table or a G7 table with Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher and Helmut Kohl and François Mitterrand and others, you knew that the progress we were making and the inevitable demolition of the Soviet Union, this was not an accident. This happened because of their leadership. In a brilliant address delivered some years ago in Toronto, I should tell you that it was Heather Reisman and David Peterson who had organized that. It was an event at the Liberal Party of Ontario. Ted Sorensen, Himself a skilled observer of powerful leaders, a special counsel to Presidents Kennedy and Johnson, said, and I remember Ted and I served on boards until his death, and we talked about this speech because it had so impressed me. I said, the only thing wrong is that you should talk to the conservatives about this. But he said, once in office, those who wish to stand up and stand out and leave something enduring behind must build new institutions, not new images. They must look to the next generation and not merely the next election. They must talk in terms of fundamental values, not merely costs. And they must appeal to our hopes as well as our needs, to what we long to be and to what we know is right. That, he said, is leadership. When governments and their institutions are met by unforeseen pressures, radical or extremist political prescriptions capture attention. Much of what we're witnessing these days in the U.S. reflects similar emotions of fear and anger, stimulated in large part by the sense that the government is dysfunctional or detached from public concerns, or that the global system of trade, which was so important to all of our lives, is tilted against American interests. How could they not think that way with Bernie Sanders and on the left and President Trump on the right telling them that for a number of years? I fully understand the restlessness and frustration apparent in many countries as they seek to preserve a distinct national identity in an increasingly globalized world. The global tectonic plates are indeed shifting. Change is at once the greatest advantage and the greatest challenge confronting us today. The pace of change, fueled by changes in technology, is accelerating. When fear and anger fuel much of the public debate, history teaches us that protectionist impulses can easily become a convenient handmaiden. But history also demonstrates, in Europe, North America, and throughout Asia, that the best antidote to protectionism is more liberalized trade that stimulates both economic growth and stronger employment. As Ronald Reagan said, we should always remember, protectionism is destructionism. And so it is with the Canada-US relationship. The politics of free trade were always extremely daunting, as that great Canadian Prime Minister, Sir Wilfrid Laurier, learned firsthand in 1911. For some Canadians, any negotiations at all with the United States could easily be portrayed as a prescription for disaster. Prime Minister Pearson eloquently described a chronic problem facing any Canadian chosen to negotiate with the Americans. He wrote that the picture of weak and timid Canadian negotiators being pushed around and browbeaten by American representatives into settlements that were sellouts is a false and distorted one. It is often painted, however, Mr. Pearson said, by Canadians who think that a sure way to get applause and support is to exploit our anxieties and exaggerate our suspicions over U.S. power and politics. Canada is privileged to have the United States as a neighbor and friend. And the United States should thank their lucky stars every morning that they have Canada on their northern border. This is the most successful and peaceful bilateral relationship in history, and one that must be cherished and enhanced by our leadership in a manner that is thoughtful, understanding, and wise. Critics of the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement went to bizarre lengths to try and scare Canadians into believing that the sky would fall under free trade. Medicare, old age pensions, our water, our resources, our culture, all were said to be at risk. we faced a toxic cocktail of latent anti-Americanism and narrow protectionist sentiments. They really pulled out all the stops on that one. As a prominent opposition spokesman said at the time, "We will blame every sparrow that falls on free trade."